Hi, Pastor Adam here, and we are finishing our month on discernment of TV and movies this week with the genre of romance. What does the culture say about how we should view romance, how we should treat those relationships, what we should be pursuing? Is it sustainable? Does it glorify God? What are we actually glorifying when we watch these movies and TV shows that have something to say about romance? If that sounds like something you're interested in, then this is the sermon for you. Okay, so good morning, everyone, to our, streaming audience. Good morning and welcome back. So as I said, we're back this morning for our final message and our, final investigation into what it means to discern the messages and themes we see in movies and television, the video arts, if you will. As we know, those of you that have been with us, the last couple weeks we've taken a look into specific genres as we analyze what the cultural outputs in this battlefield are. So a couple weeks ago we talked about comedy and tried to extract how and why comedy is used and what it says about us, what it says about man. All comedy seems to be rooted in irony. And irony is, precisely the situation we find ourselves in before God. The truth that things are not as they, are meant to be. Things are not as God would want them to be. And we ask the question of, is your view of comedy within the proper context? That we're fallen before God, that what's funny is the absurdity in our nature and the way that we sort of fumble about when we suppress the truth of who God is and who we are. Comedy can be used as a tool for us, as useful, and not just a meaningless pursuit of, laughter as the be-all and end-all, because that leads to a cynical outlook on life. But in the proper context and with the proper perspective of who God is and who we are, comedy can be useful in pointing out certain truths. So that was a couple weeks ago. And then last week we sort of cracked open the door on horror. Why do we take pleasure in fear was sort of the basis for that. Why do we seek it out? Why does our culture continually pump out these works of horror and what is in it for us? Why do we delight in it? Why do we pleasure in it? And we talked about the truth that the truth is that we are created to fear. This is what God wants for us. He wants a proper fear, though, fear of Him and how that plays itself out. But our culture misunderstands, misappropriates that. It has a sort of a deviant relationship with fear as a consequence of continued suppression of truth. We deviate in that and we attempt to control the fear ourselves because we don't want to submit to who God is. And we turn it into something that it's not meant to be, which is a deviant pleasure, delighting in these things that we shouldn't be. And horror films, we talked about almost more than any other genre, have this intrinsic link to morality. And so what does that say about us when we pump these works out, but we are faithful to portraying good and evil, when we recognize this supreme truth of what good and evil is and how horror seems to be loyal to this depiction of good and evil? Can we spot it and recognize it and what it says when we catch these types of things within this genre? We need to ultimately ask ourselves the question of how or why it's worthwhile to, sort of participate, to consume works of horror, either personally or, for the people around us. Can our participation in that, watching these movies, can we use it in a useful and a productive way for God? And that was sort of the question we ended on, the challenge we ended on. So today, and just as I said, for one last time, it's my last sermon week, I want to touch down on another genre. But before we do that, this is obviously not an exhaustive list of all movie genres. My point has just been to introduce, sort of broad topics in movies, broad genres, and see what we can glean from them and what it says about who God is and who we're called to be. So by no means has this been an exhaustive list, but it's been meant to kickstart discussion and kickstart, sharpening of your mind as we constantly are consuming these things, and comedy, horror, today will be romance. These are big influential genres within movies and shows that have a tendency to shape the culture, shape the way we view the world. We go and we consume these things, and then we walk away with ideas about how we're going to live that out. I've been talking about the need to, have certain walls up and have the ability to recognize when, deviant truths are presented to us, so that we don't continue to suppress, ultimate truth in who God is. So romance. Romance. The screen has a nasty habit of forming, as I said, everything that we view about everything that there is. And that includes, of course, romance. From the time we're young, even, Disney movies. Disney movies are some of the most popular movies, and for decades have been some of the first thing you introduce to your kids. And almost always within those Disney movies, there's a classic trope of, this idea of romance, the prince and the princess, and so on and so forth. Ideas about what a woman should be, what a man should be, how they should come together, the ideal romantic life. Now it's deviated even further, and it's not necessarily that man-to-woman thing as we know. Recent Disney Pixar movies, subvert that and, start to try to normalize other things outside of the traditional context of what God sets up. But from the time we're young, we're introduced to these things, or some of the first things that we're shown from our parents, or some of the first movies we see are these movies geared toward young children, and within those, the idea of romance is heavily present. I wrote down here, it's deviated even further from man to woman. There was a movie a couple of years ago that was like an Academy Award, Best Picture, Best Director, it was in all the categories. And it was a romance movie about a man and like a fish creature. I don't know if you guys saw it. It's called The Shape of Water. But we have utterly deviated from what's biblically normative in terms of romance. And granted, that wasn't a kid's movie, so or wasn't geared toward kids, but deviancy exists within romance is my point. And Hollywood leads an aggressive attack on our minds as to what we should and shouldn't accept when it comes to this, when it comes to the topic of romance and when it comes to the topic of love. And for generations, we feed on it. Our culture feeds on it. What's the classic, date formula? You go to dinner and a movie, right? That's at least in America, I think, maybe worldwide. That's the classic, cliche sort of first date, dinner and a movie. Oftentimes, if you're trying to be, cool or suave or whatever, it's dinner and a romance movie, It's not dinner and Schindler's List. That would be an interesting study, though, to see people back then, what was it, the early 90s when Schindler's List came out, of people that took their first date or whatever to Schindler's List, how many of those things ended up well? How many of those relationships ended up on a positive? Because that's a heavy movie. Traditionally, it's dinner and a movie, and oftentimes it's dinner and a romance movie. And there's actually kind of irony if you think about that. We go to a movie with our date to figure out how we should be on our date, to be influenced by this genre of romance, to get an idea of how to be romantic and loving rather than coming from a place of being informed into what that looks like. We go to be informed in this sort of weird, sort of paradoxical, ironic thing. Dinner and a movie, dinner and romance. And for the record, people treat their whole lives like that. They go out into the world seeking inputs into how to be rather than coming into the world, as we're called to be, with a foundation and an input. But anyways, we go to the movies to be influenced by romance, to get an idea of how we should play that out in our relationship. And the culture's view of what is beautiful, what is attractive, desirable, comes largely from the screen. It's taught us, whether rightly or wrongly, what romance is and how it works, how it starts, how it grows, how it either ends or lasts forever, or how it's okay if it doesn't last at all. right? That's what we see a lot nowadays. We're even primed for the end of romance and told that it's normal. It's normal for this romance and love to end. And if it's if not good, it's at least presented as morally neutral. So we're primed for the end. We live in a divorce culture. Like 60% or more of marriages end with the end of that. The negative outcome of that because of an improper understanding of what, a relationship should be, a romantic relationship should be, with a faulty idea of how relationships should work out and how we should fall into these relationships or seek out these relationships, how we should interact within them. Media teaches us, as I said, what the ideal man or woman is, the role of sexuality within relationships, and what it takes to make us happy. This is all the kinds of things we see in, romance movies and how they seek to influence us on just a number of different levels. And oftentimes, we're not actually taught what romance is at all, but another common cultural substitute. And we're taught what lust is instead. Not what biblical romance is. We're taught what lust is and that we should pursue that. The power, the necessity, and even the goodness of lust, a lustful relationship. Pursuit of passion is the ultimate good. Emotional and physical passion. That's the culture's best idea of what romance is. And it has a real slick way of playing on your feelings to sort of adopt that and accost that idea and claim it, Movies are powerful in that way. How many movies extol the love detached, the friends with benefits message? Back when I worked at the theater, like in 2011 or something, there was like 3 movies in one summer that all came out, like with big time movies with big time actors. That's exactly what it was. No strings attached, or friends with benefits, or whatever. Like this is what the culture's idea of romance is, pursuing these things, and it tells you that this is good and this is normal, and you shouldn't feel bad about it. This is just how we're called to live and interact within these types of relationships, to figure it out. We tell ourselves that it's okay. We're convinced by the message that it's okay and normal, and we celebrate and promote these movies. And we tell ourselves that it's okay because that's the characters that do that. I would never do that. That's not me. But I'm taking pleasure in it on some level, and why and how. The truth is that, as I've been saying, unless you're actively putting in place these things in your mind, this biblical perspective of what these different genres are and how the movies influence them, then we are, on some level, celebrating them and promoting them. When you celebrate it and promote it, you are almost always subject to it if the proper measures aren't put in place, if you don't have a properly discerning mind. Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, "Put to death sinful earthly things lurking within you have nothing to do with sexual immorality." This idea of sexual immorality, just to stop myself, it's all over. It's all over Scripture. It's all over the Old and New Testament. God's people are called to live and interact those types of relationships in a very specific way and separated from how the world treats them and interacts with them. He says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, "God's will is for you to be holy, so stay away from sexual sin. Then each of you will control his own body and live in holiness and honor, not in lustful passion like the pagans do, like the people of the world do, like the non-believers do, people who don't know God and God's ways." Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, "You've heard the commandment. You must not commit adultery, but I say anyone who even looks at a woman in this way has already done it in his heart." And he talks about if your eye does bad, gouge your eye out. If your hand does bad, cut it off so that you can't continue sinning. But the common message about sexual immorality is there. Paul talks about it. James talks about it. He says it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and 2 Timothy. He writes to Timothy about it. The author of in the book of James, we see this message of relationships and how we interact with them on a romantic level versus how the world treats them. We're supposed to be separated from this. The blueprint for romance isn't that we lust with no strings attached, but that we have that outwork in our marriage relationship, in a committed, faithful marriage relationship. That's the natural outlet and location for romantic love. Not that it's, free and flippant with anybody you come across and, pursue the passion, pursue the pleasure, pursue the feelings that come with it as what's normative. That's not what's normative, according to Scripture. The Song of Solomon, it's a whole book dedicated to this. A whole book dedicated to the gift of proper, committed marriage relationship and what we see and can experience and enjoy and delight and pleasure in when it's in its proper context. It stands as a testament to the beauty of that gift that God gives us, that marriage relationship and true romance. And it does it in beautiful, poetic, sometimes detailed and graphic language. The author of Hebrews in chapter 13 says, "Give honor to marriage and remain faithful to one another in marriage. God will surely judge people who are immoral and those who commit adultery." I don't think it's a hard conclusion to draw that the way the culture treats and interacts with romance and love and these relationships it's completely against God in that way. When God ordained the relationship between Adam and Eve, he set in motion something large, something far greater than just, the first two humans created. Through them, he sets the tone for how we should, on a foundational level, understand romance. But he didn't make romance to be a sort of be-all and end-all. An end in itself, just to be a source of great pleasure and satisfaction between two humans. That's not just what he set up. His ultimate intention in this, and we see this throughout the Bible, was for the one-to-one dedication to be and exclusivity to function as a sign for his, love for us. And we see this analogy and metaphor used in Scripture, the marriage relationship as God is married to us. He chose this simple image, a groom and a bride, as a greater metaphor for his marriage to his people. As I said, it's found from Genesis through the Old Testament and in his prophets, from the Gospels into Revelation. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says that this principle of the woman, or he talks about this principle of the woman being used as a symbol of the church, and Christ being the head, just as man leads and loves his wife as the head of their union. And in Revelations chapters 12 and 17, this symbol is split in two versions, the pure woman and the impure woman, the adulterous woman. And it pops up again countless times in Jeremiah, in Isaiah chapter 1 and 57, and Ezekiel chapter 16. It's the constant warning and condemnation that God delivers to the prophets of Israel. He's using this metaphor of marriage, committed. This idea of romance looks a certain way when it is faithful and committed. Excuse me. If the metaphor that God uses is based on this sort of romance and love rather than the culture's, how we live that out and reflect it in our own relationships and what we choose to glorify and, pleasure in, probably says something about how we view God and our relationship with him and how we treat that same relationship that he treats with us. The reciprocity in that is what I mean. If our view of what a relationship looks like is becoming so skewed because of the movies we watch, then the chances are we're going to have a skewed and misunderstanding of our relationship with God. This theme of adultery is ripe within media. And we're sort of convinced by it. I'll explain what I mean. We're convinced by adultery. We buy it when it's justified to us, in movies. Movies with these types of themes, of adulterous themes, characters, or whatever. It's presented in a package that it's like, oh yeah, like I get why she would do that. It makes sense, and we take it in and we accept it instead of call it out. It's presented as understandable to us and justifiable, and it sinks its claws, as I said, into the feelings. It sinks its claws into your emotions, rather than what's right and true and honorable and pure before God. And we're betrayed by our feelings in this way. And we're told to keep on suppressing what is good and right and true. And it stems from this idea of boredom. That's what you see a lot in these characters and what you hear in maybe people around you. Bored in your life, bored in your relationship because of a misunderstanding of what that relationship should look like. The character in the movie is bored in her life, bored in her marriage, bored in the mundane, bored in the predictable, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, yeah, that would suck to be in her shoes. We're told to cheer on the cheater, if you will, to cheer the cheater. How many people like Nicholas Sparks movies? Women? Be honest. Josh says no. By the way, I didn't realize how many Nicholas Sparks books turned movies there actually have been over the last 20 years. There's a lot. I was looking it up. I didn't realize he was so prolific. That's a common theme in Nicholas Sparks movies. And as people, whether on dates, women, I hate to say it, but it's your guilty pleasure. You go and you watch these movies where these themes are highly prevalent. For whatever reason, he seems to continue to hit on this formula, this in his romance movies, because if you don't know, that's his bread and butter. He's not writing action movies or books turned to movies. But we're told to cheer on these characters, Why? Why are we cheering that on? Why are we going to these movies as our, as I said, guilty pleasure? What are we getting from that? What are we getting from that? Are we celebrating those movies? Can't wait for the next one. That one looks so good. Oh, it's going to make me cry. It's this girl or this guy even. He's in this situation and he finds this girl. Maybe it's a past love, that he reconnects with, and he abandons he or she abandons their marriage or something to go pursue a past love or to pursue this type of love or pursue this or pursue that, and damn the consequences, damn what it means, what it implies, what it says, what it leaves behind. Why do we consider these movies worthy of our tears? Why do we let them shake us up so much? Are we asking ourselves, what is actually being said about these characters? What is good or bad in there? Why are we letting our emotions dominate our feeling toward these things? As long as they're meant for each other, is the idea we have. That's the message that's prevalent. Doesn't matter what happens. Doesn't matter if you're in a relationship even already. Just cheat on your partner because you've now found the one you've always meant to be with. You're reunited with your first love. We buy it and we celebrate it. We go to the movies. We talk about it. We cry at it. And we translate it to something culturally normative. We should call it what it is. It's selfish. It's unbiblical. It's anti-God. And it arises from self-love, for pursuing pleasure for pleasure's sake. It's funny how you don't ever see the follow-up to those movies. The character who left her husband to pursue the past love. Where's the sequel to that movie where you see the broken family? That's sad. But we don't see that. We just want this nice idea, romantic, meant to be together picture, and we don't want to play that out in real life. We don't want to think about what it means, and the consequences that are laid bare for generations, okay? Come from that. I can tell you all about it. It sucks. 20 years later, I get to experience the consequences of this type of thing. My kids get to experience the consequences of this type of thing, and it hurts. But the movies, they don't want to show that because it's not pleasant. They just want your feel-good dopamine endorphins, and they want you to take away this, sort of culturally normative thing that you should pursue, this faulty idea of romance rather than the reality of it. So I don't watch those movies. We want what we don't have. It seems to be the common theme in these romance movies. To escape boredom, to escape boring reality, we want what we don't have. Starts to sound an awful lot like something familiar. This is how sin entered the world, wanting what we don't have, being tricked and convinced by this. Starts to quickly boil down to an issue of faith in God. What Hollywood tells us is that we have to have a movie-style romance in order to find real joy. It has to be exciting all the time, The feelings have to be always there, the feels. Never a dull moment. Always firing in your heart. Always fluttering. But romance out of context and in the wrong perspective and romance for the sake of pleasure and for romance's sake it can be destructive. It sounds intoxicating on its surface. And, this idea of falling in love, it produces actual brain chemistry, going on. Dopamine, the feel-good chemicals, serotonin, adrenaline going on. It produces these feel-good things, and that can be addicting. And so we have to be careful with that. We have to keep our mind and literally our bodies in check when it comes to that. It becomes an addiction for many people, chasing this faulty idea of romance based on how it plays out, physiologically even. Feasting on emotional porn, if you will, such as, movies and books and songs. These TV shows that are themed around this. It sets up for us an unrealistic expectation in our real life relationships. And then studies, for the record, show that this high that's produced in its initial state, at best it lasts 2 years before you're looking to chase the next one. You're looking to chase the next high before that wears off and you're looking for literally the next high of dopamine and serotonin when you're pursuing that type of relationship and infatuation and romance as the culture attaches to it. When we overdose on vicarious romance, we set ourselves up with false expectations and needless feelings of disappointment in the real world. But this is what the culture chases, and this is what the culture promotes. And the truth is, there's a deeply suppressed truth that real romantic happiness is grounded not in an excitement high, but in satisfaction, the choice to be satisfied. The choice to be satisfied rather than being swept away by our feelings. Constant longing for some kind of fantasy that is forever unsatisfying. There's a profound narrative truth in Scripture when we think about God's love for his people. Could he have made a perfect people after the fall? Like a new creation, I mean? A different creation for himself? Sure. But he chooses to be satisfied in his creation. This is the gospel, right? He chooses to be satisfied in us, despite who we are and how we treat him. Romans 5 is the power verse for y'all. When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us. Most people wouldn't be willing to die for an upright person. Though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. He chose to be satisfied in us. We have a choice to be satisfied in him in this regard, and in what he sets up and ordains when it comes to relationship. It would be easy to imagine, to desire, a preferable God who would let me do whatever I want, let me chase whatever pleasure I want, let me chase the feelings that I have, who would permit me to be selfish and get away with it, who would be satisfied with my dissatisfaction in him. But this leads us nowhere. It leads, ultimately, no one's satisfied in this, not you or God. So again, our concept and idea of romance seems to stem from the ultimate designer of it, choosing to be satisfied in the relationships. And our reproduction of it, literally the way we copy it and apply it to our relationships in the world, it says something about where we understand our place before God and who he is. The myth that Hollywood creates about romance is that the key to true romance is a combination of, super idealized beauty and perfection, an unending excitement high, and with an open-minded attitude toward physical intimacy, pursuing pleasure. The antithesis of Hollywood romance is the myth that committed, faithful, lifetime marriage relationships, normal, non-idealized couples is unsatisfying. That's the myth that culture presents. That is ultimately unsatisfying. It's boring. It's no fun. The predictability is boring compared to what, we can offer, compared to what we can sell. I had an old coworker who literally challenged, as me and my boss, we were talking to him, challenged our marriage, I guess you could say. And he was asking us why we choose to be committed to one person, to one marriage, and isn't that boring? Isn't your life boring? This guy was constantly seeking the next high in life, A lot of times in relationships, he would come to work on a Monday, either really high or really low, based on the weekend he just had with the relationships he had with people. We were both my life is far from boring when it comes to my relationship, And he was also challenging, why we have kids. I don't know. It was coming from a I guess, a sincere place, seeking truth, I guess. But he honestly thought, he couldn't understand or fathom, the life we choose when it comes to our relationships and then, the things that follow in that. And he actually asked us, isn't it boring? This is what the culture adopts. Our cultural representations of romance, of love, and marriage attempt to suppress and neutralize God. They want to sweep us away from it. They pull us from it. But when we choose to be satisfied in who he is and what he created and ordained, we can rediscover a true idea of romance. I want to quote from that book that I have been reading this last month. He concludes with this thought. He says, while ambiguity is interesting and even exciting, we need to learn that the excitement of continually discovering a person you love is much like the continual unfolding excitement of loving God and getting to know him better. Choosing to be satisfied always leads to satisfaction. There is always more to learn, more to love, more that you uncover and experience. And this is why real romantic love with someone can last a lifetime. He's comparing it with our relationship with God in the same way. We're never at a dull moment if we're truly seeking God. We're always uncovering, learning something else, learning about a new aspect of his love and our relationship with him. He says, this is why real romantic love with someone can last a lifetime. And isn't that the most romantic thing you can hope for? I'm going to present some questions, but before I do that, Heidi and Aiden are going to get ready, because right after we end this time, before we go to cell group, Aiden's going to he has a presentation for us. So let me ask these questions. Stick in your seats. Heidi and Aiden will come up. After they're done, we'll break for our cell groups and we'll discuss. Are your ideas of romance preconceived? Have they been wrongly shaped by media, by culture? What other lies can you spot within this genre of romance and these movies about love? Where does the emphasis lie, and how have they negatively influenced you? Have you been battling this faulty idea of romance as you grew up, or are growing up, or are, pursuing a relationship now even? What are you chasing, or what have you chased when it comes to your pursuit of romance? What are you looking for? And is it an idol for you in that regard? Does your romance have an out, or is it committed? How do you choose satisfaction in your relationships? What does that look like? Where is your focus? And then lastly, as just sort of a wider sweeping question for the month, and since our year of discernment is against the larger backdrop of sacrifice, thinking about everything we've talked about, movies and television, having a discerning mind and all that, sacrifice being the backdrop of our 5-year plan, our 5-year arc, is there something you need to give up when it comes to your participation in movies and TV as we end the month on discernment of these things? Is there something you need to give up because it's useless to you, because it's unproductive to you, because it's unhealthy for your relationship before God, because it's unproductive with your relationships with other people? Are you adopting deviant truths in your consumption of media? Is there something you need to give up? Maybe for good, maybe for now. I don't know. That's for you to decide. Is there something you need to give up?